haven't heard. Yeah, let me know. We'll do it. I'm not. Absolutely not. No, that's true.
Happy Easter with very nice broadly. You have been on my mind. Hey, I liked that end song.
Oh, the mashup?
Yeah, I was here for it. Threw me off the vibe.
It's all the name stuff. It's just like a praise the name, we're powerful. Jesus, Jesus.
I did a Chimera, like, I haven't seen your house yet.
But you think that they don't like I would compliment your sound, but I can't really hear. So I'm really stuffed up because of my allergies. So I haven't been able to hear for like 3 weeks. I should probably go to the doctor. Probably won't. So whatever. These are really hard to hand out because the stick is so short. There's so much cellophane. Also, 4th and 5th graders taxis. Elementary school is packed space.
For different pictures.
bother you off and on, like a rock in your shoe. Or it will startle you, like the first crash of thunder in a summer storm. Or it will lodge itself beneath your skin like a splinter. Or it will show up again, like the uninvited guest whose heavy footsteps you recognize anywhere, appearing at your front door with a suitcase in hand at the worst possible time. Doubt will pull you out, further out to sea like a riptide, or hold your head under as you drown. Triggered by an image, a question, something the pastor said, something that doesn't add up, the unlikelihood of it all, the too good to be trueness of it all, the way the lady in the thick perfume behind you sings, "Up from the grave he arose," with more confidence in the single line of a song than you've managed to muster in the past 10 years. And you'll be sitting there in that dress you pulled out from the back of your closet, swallowing down the bread and wine, not believing a word of it. Not a word. So you'll fumble through those back pocket prayers, "Help me in my unbelief," while everyone around you moves on to verse 2, verse 3, verse 4 without you. You will feel their eyes on you, and you will recognize the concern behind their cheery greetings. "We haven't seen you here in a while. So good to have you back." And you'll know what they're thinking, exactly what you used to think about Easter Sunday Christians. Nominal, lukewarm, indifferent. But you won't know how to explain that there is nothing nominal or lukewarm or indifferent about standing in this hurricane of questions every day and staring each one down until you have mustered all the bravery and fortitude and trust it takes to whisper just one of them out loud in the car ride home. What if we made this up because we're afraid of death? And you won't know how to explain why in that moment when the whisper rose out of your mouth like Jesus from the grave, you felt more alive and awake and resurrected than you have in ages, because at least it was out. At least it was said. At least it wasn't buried in your chest anymore, clawing for freedom. And if you're lucky, someone in the car will recognize the bravery of that act. If you're lucky, there will be a moment of holy silence before someone wonders out loud if such a question might put a damper on Easter brunch. But if you're not, if the question gets answered too quickly, or if the silence goes on too long, please know you are not alone. There are other people singing words to hymns they're not sure they believe today. Other people digging out dresses from the backs of their closet today. Other people ruining Easter brunch today. Other people just showing up today. And sometimes just showing up, burial spices in hand, is all it takes to witness a miracle.
Would you all stand and sing with us? Let no one caught in sin remain inside the lie of inward shame, but fix our eyes upon the cross and run to him who showed great love and bled for us. Freely you have bled for us. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling over death by death.
Good to see you. Welcome to our We are glad you're here. Jonathan, can you turn those lights just so I can see everybody real quick? We're thrilled that you would come and spend the morning with us and be in community with us. So I've always had this problem with like people putting words in my mouth when it comes to church, and like this thing where you say stuff together or pray a prayer together, and the reason I've always had trouble with it is because I think I always thought it was like you're putting words in my mouth, or it makes it insincere for me, or rote, or mechanical, or mindless, and so I think I've always, in some rebellious way, like, no, I'm not going to do that. But I've also come to the conclusion that there's something powerful that happens when we do say things in one voice. When we do, kind of as a community, you've got people to your left, to your right, you may or may not know them. I think there's something that happens when these people that you may or may not know, and you all agree on something. I think there's a power in that. And I don't think it's the only way, but I think it's one way. It's like singing songs. I mean, some of you go, why do we sing these songs? I get those questions. But I think there's something powerful about singing these things together. And so it's because of that for hundreds and hundreds of years, people on Easter morning have said something like this: He is risen. And so you go, what did they say? I don't know. I get it. He is risen indeed. That this phrase has been spoken. And sometimes I feel like, well, you're just conducting me. And like, no. I don't want you to say it if you don't want to. But if you do, there's something powerful to say this together. He is risen. He is risen indeed. Turn to the person you may or may not know you're left to right and say he is risen. Go ahead and see what they say. Okay, that mumbling's a little weird. Okay, so we are glad glad you're here to celebrate with us. We are going to sing. Why don't you go ahead and stand? And I am going to pray for us that in the midst of this morning of celebration, we will come and in one voice proclaim some things today. Pray with me. Father, very grateful to be here. I'm very grateful that in one voice we can proclaim resurrection. May this Easter, may this day, may this time together be something that does something in us, individually and as a community. We're very, very grateful that you're here with us. The presence of God is in this place. We don't have to invite you to come in because you showed up already. And you being here with us and alongside us, and us alongside each other, may we experience that power, and may something miraculous happen in each of us today. It's in the name of Jesus I pray.
Father, we're gathered here this morning in the power of Christ, and we stand here singing in one voice to praise the name that is above every other name. And we thank you for once again gathering us to this place. We pray that your Spirit would guide our time together. We pray that your Spirit would open our hearts to this radical truth of a man who lived and died and rose from the dead 2,000 years ago, that would somehow shape us into new individuals. So God, we thank you. We are thankful for him, and it is in the name of Jesus Christ that we pray. Amen.
Again, it's really good to have you here with us and to be in this gathering. There's a short story many years ago called A Good Man Is Hard to Find. And it's a story about a family of 5. There's a mother, a father, a little boy, a little girl, and a very unlikable grandmother. And the story is, did any of you read that story in this class, A Good Man Is Hard to Find? You probably did. Flannery O'Connor wrote it. This is a picture of Flannery. That's actually a stamp, her photo stamp. She is known for her short stories, her novels. Her style has been called Southern Gothic. She relied heavily on characters from the South. She's from Georgia. Often very dark, often very violent characters. And she wrote about dark and violent situations. She was actually raised in the church, very, very faithful, and faith and morality and ethics are caught and all intertwined into her writings. You should look up her stuff if you've never read it. But in this story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which this art piece there is someone's representation of that story. This family of 5 is traveling from Atlanta down to Florida, and they take a back road. And when they take that back road, they have an accident, and they go off an embankment, and their car is down the side, and they're kind of stranded down there. And as they're stranded, 3 men come upon them. These 3 men have all just escaped from prison, and one of them is named the Misfit. And the Misfit is a renowned criminal, and they're all looking for him everywhere. He's a very violent, very broken man. Well, the other 2 men that are with the Misfit first take the father and the son and take them off to the edge of the woods, and you hear 2 gunshots. You assume they've been killed. And then a few minutes later, they take the mother and the daughter, and it's the same thing, 2 gunshots. So we're left with this very unlikable grandmother that is there with the Misfit. And she begins to plead for her life. And in pleading for her life, she calls out to Jesus to save her. And in words that I think are incredibly appropriate for Resurrection Sunday, the Misfit responds to the grandmother calling out to Jesus like this. Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the Misfit said. And he shouldn't have done it. He'd thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if you didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but to enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure, but meanness, he said. And his voice had become almost a snarl. He goes on and he talks about Jesus and his resurrection, especially his crucifixion. And he says, I wish I'd been there, Misfit says, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I'd been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. I assume this means if he had seen this, if he had experienced it, he would have been a different person. But he said, this is who I am. Well, the grandmother saw the man's face twisted close to hers, O'Connor writes, and as if he were going to cry. So she suddenly has compassion and she murmurs, why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children, she says. And she reaches out and touches him on the shoulder. The Misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him, and he shot her 3 times through the chest. And he put his gun down on the ground, took off his glasses, and began to clean them. I thought that was a perfect way to begin an Easter service. I actually think it is a good way to start. Because again, to quote Misfit, Jesus throws everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, this Easter morning, I have no desire to argue with you to prove the resurrection. Because I am convinced That the resurrection isn't something we explain, it's something we live. And the resurrection is something that we breathe. There's this sign that is outside the church in Jerusalem. It's near the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed, was arrested, all that type of stuff before he was crucified. And the sign says, please no explanations inside the church. So it's just right outside the door as you enter this church. And the purpose of the sign, to my understanding, is to discourage the talkative tour guides from coming through and shouting lectures and explanations while the service is going on, or to disrupt the prayerful ambiance of the sanctuary or something like that. I think it applies to us today. Because for us today, there's nothing wrong with trying to understand or explain this complicated narrative of Easter. Nothing wrong with it at all. I've read many good things and many bad things that do just that, or try to do just that. But that's actually, I think, for us, work for another day. Because I would hate to tame the dangerous mystery and put it into a manageable argument, a controlled explanation. That's not what I'm looking to do, especially today. I'm not looking to do that. So I think this sign applies. Jim Friedrich is a Episcopal priest near Seattle, and he writes, you know what? Easter Sunday is for proclamation, not explanation. It is a time to meet the one who changes everything. I agree. So let's enter into a story of resurrection from Scripture. There are 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that give the account of Jesus, and they give an account of resurrection. And they're all different in detail somewhat when it comes to the resurrection, but especially they have different feels to them. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which they call the synoptics, those first 3, they speak of these dazzling apparitions of earthquakes and of fear and amazement among the witnesses around the resurrection. John, which is the 4th, John has a little different atmosphere from the other 3 writers that he's trying to create. John's account is fairly calm in comparison. It's kind of unspectacular for the most part, no earthquakes, nothing like that. Leslie Newbegin, who is a theologian and missiologist, he says that John's account of the resurrection seems to be based more on maybe relationships, and specifically with Mary Magdalene. Now, the story of the resurrection, Jesus is a star. Cool, okay, because he resurrects from the dead. But other than Jesus, the star of John's account is Mary Magdalene. Here is John's account of the resurrection of Jesus. And just so you know, right before this verse that we read, John chapter 20, verse 1, 2 days before, in fact, Jesus was crucified and died and laid in the tomb. Verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, they probably say it's about 4 to 6 a.m., most scholars estimate, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. So why was she there? Well, and the other Gospels say this, that she was probably bringing some type of burial spice or something for the body. Probably true. But I also think Mary came this early in the morning just to weep and just to mourn. I think because she just needed to be there because there was no place else to be. Because when you read the story of Mary Magdalene, and this is a different Mary than the mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene's story is one where she follows Jesus and she becomes a follower somewhat. And so she's bought into this. And I think now that he is dead, I think she just needed to be somewhere because there was no place else to be. She went, and then nothing else seemed to matter, probably because she'd kind of given her life to follow him. And so I believe she came just to be at the tomb and to be silent and to weep. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple. So there's some like 12 that are closest to Jesus. And the other disciple here, the one whom Jesus loved, it says, we believe to be John, who wrote this, we think. And so Simon Peter and the other disciple, and she said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him. So there seems to be, on Mary's part, no expectation of anything miraculous happening. Someone's come in, someone stole this body. If you notice, it says, we do not know where they've laid him. That goes along with the other accounts that it was Mary and some of the other women. But Mary is, again, the star of this particular story. Verse 3, it says, Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I just think it's funny that John loves to point out he's faster than Peter. And so Peter's probably a little older than John. John's probably in his late teens. Peter's older than that. I don't know. But I just think it's hilarious that John thinks that's important. Verse 5, he bent down to look in. So John did. And he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. So John comes, being the faster runner, gets there first and looks in, but he stays outside the tomb. But Peter, true to Peter's character, came following him and went into the tomb. So to me, is again consistent with what we read in Scripture throughout Peter's character, is Peter's like, wait up, John. He gets there and John's like, what's going on? Boom, Peter runs right by. Because Peter's impetuous. He wants to know. He wants to figure out. He wants to learn what is going on. And what he saw the linen wrappings lying there. Verse 7, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head. Not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So when you would bury a body, you would wrap it in these cloths, and you would help it, keep it from smelling, and all that type of stuff. And you would lay it in this tomb. And there's one for the body, and there's one for the head. So if you picture this scene, if someone had taken a body, which is an argument, they've not only gone to the trouble of unwrapping the body. Like, if I'm going to go steal a body, I'm not going to unwrap the thing. I'm just going to take it as is and go with it. But they've gone to the trouble of unwrapping it, but they've also taken the cloth off his head, and they've laid it out, most believe, to create this effect. So it portrays this image that the body wasn't picked up and unwrapped, but for me, the image that comes to mind is it just like disappeared, like air being deflated from a balloon. And it just collapsed because it was set out like that. Well, then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, again, John mentions his track prowess, also went in. So John, after Peter has seen this, John goes in. And he saw and he believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So at that moment, this is my question there, I would have asked, so John, first of all, how'd you get so fast as a runner? And then I would have said, what is it you exactly believe? Like, what is it that you suddenly believe? Because then the disciples returned to their home. It says they didn't understand, but what is it that they believed then? I'm going to assume that when they went back to home, they probably ran, kind of that excited run, like nobody's going to believe this, but they could have walked. And if they walked, I think they probably would have said, okay, Peter, what do you think's going on here? The body's gone, right? Yeah. Well, what is it? Do you think? I mean, who would have stolen the body? I think they're sorting through those things. But verse 11 says, turns our story back to Mary. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. She must have followed them back, and she is there at the tomb. And she wept, it says still in verse 11. She bent over to look into the tomb. And the next verse there. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. And she saw the two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and another at the feet. So one thought I had was, were they there and Peter and John just didn't see them? Like they didn't notice the angels? I don't think so. But by the way, when angels show up in Scripture, they're almost always addressing issues that people don't, like they're addressing people who have no idea what's going on. Because that's what they do. And they say to her in verse 13, woman, why are you weeping? And she says to them, well, they have taken away my Lord. And I don't know where they've laid him. He's gone. I came here and he's gone. When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. Ah, Jesus, she said. No. She did not know it was Jesus. She didn't recognize him. Jesus said to her, so woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said, sir, I appreciate you asking, if you could tell me if you have carried him away, or tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Mary still does not understand that this miraculous thing has happened. And then in verse 16, I think this is one of the most intimate descriptions we have in Scripture. I don't think there's very few things like it in all of Scripture, especially the Gospels. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. So here's the thing. Remember, it wasn't Jesus' face. Like, she's like, oh, yeah, you look familiar. Jesus. No, it wasn't his face. And it wasn't his touch. It was his voice calling her name that made all the difference. And Jesus said to her in verse 17, do not hold on to me. I bet she just grabbed him. Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Jesus goes, okay, here's what you do. Go tell them what has happened. And tell them everything has changed. And let go of me because you're cutting off my circulation. You know, like, come on, go do this. So I think it's always important to mention here, especially when you read this account in John, that if someone had wanted to concoct a plot and invent a story about seeing Jesus, they wouldn't have dreamed of giving the star part to a woman. In this, especially in this culture, first century, ancient world, no one would have appealed to a woman for a testimony to anything. You just wouldn't do that in the culture. And so for those people, maybe some of you, who like to say, you know, the Bible's anti-woman, New Testament's anti-woman, I think we fail to see how central the story of women are to the story of Jesus. It was Mary, his mother, who was told of Jesus coming. The other Gospels tell us how the women were the primary witnesses, actually Gospels too, were the primary witnesses of the crucifixion. And then this first person to see the risen Lord here is actually Mary Magdalene. While his disciples were allowed only to see the grave clothes, Peter and John, all they got to see were empty grave clothes. Here's Mary getting to meet. Mary had the indescribable privilege of seeing him first. Verse 18. Well, she goes and she announces to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. I don't know if it was like, hey, guess what? I saw him. I don't know if it was like, top of her lungs, I've seen the Lord. I don't know. And then she says, these are the things that he has said to me. These closest followers of Jesus appeared to all be together. They appear to be behind closed doors. My guess is they're probably still frightened, because on Friday they all fled. When Jesus was arrested, they scattered because they thought they were going to get arrested and killed and all that kind of stuff too. And it says in a minute that the doors are locked. But I would think Peter's already made it back, and Peter's told them that the body's gone. But now Mary comes in and says, hey, I've seen him. He says, look, this is going to happen, and this has all changed. Verse 19, when it was evening on that day, so Mary's told them, and later that evening, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Jesus came in and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Now, it's not, I don't think peace be with you here. It could be just a common greeting. Hey, peace be with you. Hey, hello, how's it going? Good day. But peace also in Hebrew is the word shalom, which we use a lot in our community, which means the way it was intended to be. And so I think there's a deeper meaning here. And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. So that would mean, hey, I want to show you where the nails went in. And I want to show you where the spear went in. And in my imagination, I imagine going around one by one. And because they all had to see it. They all had to see it up close. And then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. They saw the risen. So he was there. And I think their lives were different. These first followers had ran a couple days before. They were scared, they were flustered, they were worried, they were puzzled because what was happening was not something they were ready for. This is something they would have never, ever imagined. And for them, the idea of resurrection for them at that point was like, yeah, we believe in resurrection, that we'll die, and then in the end days, or on that last day, or whatever it was they believed, then we'll all be resurrected. Sure. But this was different. And I think only gradually, and particularly when they met Jesus, with his body fully alive, did they even realize what had happened. He had been resurrected. Like, he was dead, and now he's alive. So I imagine one of them, like when they first saw him, were like, whoa, he is risen. And somebody over here is like, indeed. And we're like, oh, that could stick. You know, and like, we'll use that. He is risen indeed. Verse 21, Jesus says this. Peace be with you. Again, shalom. Look, and I think this especially is deeper. As your Father has sent me, so I send you. Now go be bearers of this same peace, the same shalom. So 40 times in the book of John, 40 times it's mentioned that Jesus is one who has been sent by the Father. So 40 times this has gone down, and now in John, he sends them and says, I need you to complete my mission, and I want you to be sent. This is a major transference of power in that sense. Resurrection has happened. Now I need you. I've been sent, but now I'm sending you. So, this narrative, this Resurrection Sunday, this day, this resurrection proclamation, when I wrestle through passages like that, and I get it. When you come, some of you are here because you really want to be here. Some of you came because if you don't get to go to brunch with your family, or something, you're going to make somebody mad. I get the reasons that we're here. I get it. Hopefully there's some want there, and not just have to. But when I think about the resurrection of Jesus and the proclamation of, not the explanation, but the proclamation of it, I think through some very serious questions that I think have direct impact on our lives. Here's the first question I ask. What if the resurrection didn't happen? Like, what if it just didn't happen? And whatever reason, the story survived, but it was the wrong tomb, or they did steal it, or whatever. What if it didn't happen? What would that do to you? What would that do to whatever faith you may or may not have? There's a movie coming out in June. I don't know if you've seen the previews for it. Have you seen this? It's called Yesterday. And so it's what would happen if the Beatles had never been. So this dude is, the preview is actually really funny. Hopefully the movie's good. But this guy, something happens and the Beatles have disappeared from the world, except for this guy. And he knows all their songs. And he starts singing them, and they think he's written them. And so he becomes world renowned. And so, now for some of you, the fact that the Beatles never existed is a much more important question than if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. I get that. I respect that. But if you ask this question, what if the resurrection didn't happen? I go back to Flannery O'Connor and A Good Man is Hard to Find. And I say, if he didn't, using the words of the Misfit, then it's nothing for you to do but to enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. If he didn't, if the resurrection didn't happen, honestly, I would ask you the question, why are you here? And I get maybe that brunch thing factors in more than I think, but if it didn't happen, then my faith is futile. It's in vain, Paul says. So I have to ask that question. But I don't think it's fair to ask the first question without asking the second question. What if it did happen? If it is true, then the resurrection cannot be anything but the central and turning point of history. If it's true, the fulcrum on which everything turns on. It can't just be, yeah, that happened. No. It's more than that. The great C.S. Lewis wrote this when he talked about the resurrection. He said, look, if Jesus is false, then the question is of no importance. But if he's true, then it is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. The resurrection of Jesus, you gotta go, if it happened or didn't happen. It's just not like, no. If it happened, it means everything. Here's my third question though. What if we are interpreting the resurrection the wrong way? Like if we've misunderstood what it means for us. Peter Rollins, who's this from Belfast, that lives in LA now, is a theologian, philosopher, great thinker. He wrote this book of little parables. And he wrote, this is it, and it's called The Orthodox Heretic. And he wrote a parable about a community that had followed Jesus. And these people had bought in. And for months or years, they had been following Jesus. And on Friday, they were there and saw Jesus crucified on a cross. And because there was some fear for their lives, they left town on that Friday. Here's the story, the parable. Late that evening, a group of unknown disciples packed their few belongings, Friday evening, and left for a distant shore. For they could not bear to stay another moment in the place where the Messiah had just been crucified. Weighed down with sorrow, they left that place, never to return. Instead, this small community traveled a great distance in search of a land that they would call home. After months of difficult travel, they finally happened upon an isolated area that was ideal for setting up a new community, far away from everything. Here they found fertile ground, clean water, and a nearby forest from which to harvest materials needed to build shelter. So they settled there. They founded a community far from Jerusalem, a community where they vowed to keep the memory of Christ alive and live in simplicity and love, just as he had taught them to do. The members of this community lived in great solitude for over 100 years, spending their days reflecting on the life of Jesus, and attempting to remain faithful to his ways. And they did all this despite the overwhelming sorrow in their heart that Jesus had died. But their isolation was eventually broken when early one morning, a small band of missionaries reached the settlement. These missionaries were amazed at this community they found. What was most startling to them was that these people had no knowledge of the resurrection of Jesus. They had left Jerusalem before his return from the dead on the third day. Without hesitation, the missionaries gathered together all the community members, and they recounted what had occurred after the imprisonment and the bloody crucifixion of their Lord. That evening, there was a great festival, as you can imagine. There was a great festival in the camp as people celebrated the news of the Messiah, of the missionaries. The Messiah rose from the dead. I can't believe it. We thought he was dead. Yet, as the night progressed, one of the missionaries noticed that the leader of the community was absent. He had snuck off. This bothered the young man, so he set out to look for this respected elder. Eventually, he found the community's leader crouched low in a small hut on the fringe of the village, and he was praying, and he was weeping. "Why are you in such sorrow?" asked the missionary in amazement. "Today is a time of great celebration. Jesus, you thought Jesus was dead, he's alive." "It may indeed," the elder said, "be a great day for great celebration, but this is also a day of great sorrow," replied the elder, who remained crouched on the floor. "Since the founding of this community, we have followed the ways taught to us by Christ. We pursued his ways faithfully, even though it cost us dearly. And we remained resolute despite the belief that death has defeated him and would one day defeat us also." The elder slowly got to his feet and looked at the missionary compassionately in the eyes and said this: "Each day we have forsaken our very lives for him because we judged him wholly worthy of sacrifice, wholly worthy of our being. But now, following your news about his resurrection, my concern is that my children and my children's children may follow him, not because of his radical life and supreme sacrifice, but only selfishly, because his sacrifice will ensure their personal salvation and eternal life in heaven." The question that I have when I read this is, so the elder's concern, let me make sure I understand this. The elder's concern was that people would suddenly begin to interpret the resurrection from a self-interest point of view. Okay, so Jesus is alive now. We've been patterning our lives after him. Okay, that's good. But he's alive. You know what that means? It means eternal security. It means some glad morning when this life is over. I'll fly. You know, the pearly gate thing, that's happening for me. And his fear was that it would become disconnected from a larger story, and it would become nothing more than a divine insurance policy. What happens if we interpret the resurrection the wrong way? What if we only look at it as that? Then we're like what Sigmund Freud said. Sigmund Freud's criticism of people of faith was, well, they only believe in that because they need a crutch, because they're weak people, and they can't survive unless they have a crutch to get them through. If that's true, then we would put our hope only because we can't deal with the hard things of life. I don't think that's true. And that is a misinterpretation of the resurrection. Some of you have said that about people of faith. They just believe that because they need a crutch to make it through life. That some glad morning is all this is about, is not the proclamation that we're making today. So then my fourth question is this. So what happens if we interpret it the right way? Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, Easter isn't something, the resurrection isn't something we remember. It's something we live and breathe. And maybe we're called not to believe in the resurrection as much as we are to be a site where the resurrection takes place, that our lives resemble and exemplify this resurrection. So an Anglican bishop named Rowan Williams describes it this way: the believer's life is a testimony to the risenness of Jesus. He or she demonstrates that Jesus is not dead by living a life in which Jesus is the never-failing source of affirmation, challenge, enrichment, and enlargement. The believer shows Jesus as the center of his or her life. And Williams says, resurrection is about the healing and restoration of wounded and severed relationships. It's the relationship between God and humanity, but it's also the relationships between each of us, and it's also the relationship between all elements of creation. Friedrich, who I quoted earlier, said, look, resurrection has consequences. The resurrection is more than an idea we talk about or believe propositionally. It's something we become. It's something we prove in the lives of others. It's something we prove in the living of our stories. That's the resurrection. It's not something just to be explained. It's something to breathe in. The Orthodox theologian, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's something like Athenagoras said this. Said, the resurrection is not the resuscitation of a body. It is the beginning of the transformation of the world. Now that's good. So this Peter Rollins guy, there's another story of his that I tell almost every Easter. And if I don't tell it every Easter, I should. It's a story of him being at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he was there with some other theologians, and they were on the stage. And Calvin is a very large university, it's a Christian university, and he was in chapel one day. And he'd been there out throughout the week, and he'd talked various times. But this day, there were 5 of them on stage, and the students were doing a Q&A. And after hearing Rollins talk, and after asking the questions that he asked, one of the students stood up and said, Mr. Rollins, I have a question for you. Do you, they wanted to know, do you even believe in the resurrection? Or do you deny the resurrection? And Peter Rollins answered this way. He said, without equivocation or hesitation, I fully and completely admit that I deny the resurrection of Christ. That is something that anyone who knows me can tell you. And I'm not afraid to say it publicly, no matter what people may think. I deny the resurrection every time I do not serve at the feet of the oppressed. I deny the resurrection each day that I turn my back on the poor. I deny the resurrection of Christ when I close my ears to the cries of the downtrodden and lend my support to an unjust and corrupt system. He said, however, there are moments when I affirm the resurrection, few and far between as they are. He said, I affirm when I stand up for those who are forced to live on their knees. I affirm the resurrection when I speak for those who have had their tongues torn out. I affirm the resurrection when I cry for those who have no more tears left to shed. Throughout the year, I'll tell that story and read that quote in various situations, in classes I teach or places I could speak or something like that. And I've probably read it 50 to 100 times publicly. And every time I do, the goosebumps come. Every time I read about affirming or denying the crucifixion, the resurrection, something happens in me. And I think the reason that it happens is in me because I realize that in my life I affirm or deny the resurrection. I deny the resurrection when I walk by and don't pay attention. I deny the resurrection when I let what I've seen on TV affect me to the point that I become something that Jesus would never be proud of. I deny the resurrection when I treat people with no respect. I deny the resurrection when I look at this world that is broken and just brush it off. I deny the resurrection when I contribute to that brokenness. I deny the resurrection when I can't find a way to love the person that nobody else can love. I deny the resurrection every time I live in such a way. And like he said, there are few and far times in between that I sometimes affirm it. But I think the reason that it gives me goosebumps is because it's so real to me. And that I find myself in that place. So we've been in the season of Lent talking about an honest assessment of life. In an honest assessment of life, honestly looking at your life, do you affirm or do you deny the resurrection of Jesus? Here's my last question. Who is Jesus now? And where is Jesus now for us, for you? So don't hear what I'm not saying, but as much as I care about what happened to Jesus way back when, and I do, I care more about where Jesus is now for us. I actually think this is the central question of Easter. It is not a matter of our questioning the resurrection, but allowing the resurrection to question us and to say, what if it didn't happen? What if it did? Am I interpreting the right way or the wrong way? In an honest assessment of life, who we are now, who you are day to day, who I am day to day, in an honest assessment of life, I have to ask the question, what am I because of the light of the risen Jesus? Who am I because of the light of the risen Jesus? Where is he? Where is the presence of God in my life in light of the risen Jesus? Because, again, to quote the Misfit, Jesus throws everything off balance. Everything. If he did what he said, then there's nothing left for us to do but to throw away everything and follow him. But if he didn't, wow, I don't know. Let's pray. Father, it is in the grand story of Scripture that we enter in and we see the life of Jesus. We see his teachings, we see the way he treated people, the way he invited people in, the way he gave them life, quenched their thirst, gave them something they never thought they were even lacking. And then we see not just his life, but his death, sacrificial. And then we see his resurrection. And this morning we proclaim that resurrection. And my hope is that in that proclamation we find ourselves asking really, really hard questions and finding ourselves as people who incarnate the resurrection, who affirm it, not deny, who follow, who trust, who believe, however small that belief might be, and knowing that changes everything. May the centrality of that be the guiding light, force, and motivation of ours. It's in the name of Jesus I pray this. Amen. This table for us is what we call the common table, and we eat the common meal around it. You call it Eucharist, Lord's Supper. All those names are fine. We're going to invite you in just a second to come and take a piece of the bread, which we think represents the body of Christ. Dip it in the juice. Represents the blood of Christ. And there's bread and there's gluten-free crackers over here, with individual cups if you need that. And we want to invite you all to come to this table. And we want you to come to this table in the hopes of what the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus did and enter into the story. And one of the best ways I think it's described is from the book Colossians Remixed. And I want to read this to you now. In the face of a culture of death, a world of killing fields, a world of the walking dead, Christ is at the head of the resurrection parade, transforming our tears of betrayal into tears of joy, giving us dancing shoes for the resurrection party. And this glittering joker who has danced in the dragon's jaws of death now dances with a dance that is full of nothing less than the fullness of God. This is the dance of the new creation. This is the dance of life out of death. And in this dance, all that was broken, and all that was estranged, and all that was alienated, and all that was dislocated and disconnected, what once was fractured is reconciled, comes home, is healed, and is made whole. Come to this table. Take this meal, realizing that in the resurrection you have been given dancing shoes for this resurrection party. Come and take this meal. Dance up here if you want to, that's up to you. But come and take the body, blood, enter into the story of Jesus with some kind of belief that he is risen. And you're ready.
Savior now to wash our feet. Now at His feet we bow. The one who was sin and shame, now robed in majesty. The radiance of perfect love now shines for all to see. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. The fear that held us now gives way to Him who is our peace. His final breath upon the cross is now alive in me. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Sing this in one voice this morning. By your Spirit, by your Spirit, I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. On your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. Oh, the resurrected King is resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. Oh, the resurrected King is resurrecting me. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. The tomb where soldiers watched in vain was borrowed for 3 days, but His body there would not remain. This is our victory. So our God has robbed the grave. Our God has robbed the Your name is victory. All mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb, the entrance sealed by heavy stone, Messiah still and all alone. Praise that name. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord, our God. Then on the third, at break of dawn, the Son of Heaven rose again. Oh, tremble death, where into a sting the angels roar for Christ the King. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord, our God.
My soul is overwhelmed and sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.
The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And in 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. Friend, do what you came here to do.
If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends.
I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays his life down for his sheep.
Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.
It is finished.
In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth or under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Death could not hold you, the veil torn before you. You silenced the boast of sin and grave. The heavens are roaring, the praise of your glory. For you are raised to life again. You have no rival, you have no equal. Now and forever, God, you face the night, and I will rise among the saints. My gaze transfixed on Jesus' face. Lift him up. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. Oh Lord our God. Oh Lord our God. He is risen. Take a seat.
Well, thank you all for being with us here this morning of all days, of all times. Thank you for being here. Traditions are kind of a weird thing sometimes. We have a tradition here. In the great words of the great philosopher and sage Billy Crystal, he once said that Jesus died 2,000 years ago. He rose from the grave, and we celebrate with decorative Easter eggs, chocolate bunnies, and marshmallow peeps. So our tradition here, because we guess that's what Jesus liked as a kid, is to celebrate with peeps on a stick. So at every door, there's some peeps on a stick, and the way it works, the tradition is someone will hand it to you and say, "Peeps be with you," and the response is, "And also with you." Got it? Glad you guys are here. Before we let you go, we have this dream at Crossings. We feel it's the dream of God, which is things are going to be put back the way they were in the beginning. We have this Hebrew word that we use to bless each other with as we leave. It is this word that means wholeness and restoration. The way it was in the beginning, it will be in the end. And we bless each other with it as we leave. So may you go and live out the consequences of the resurrection. Shalom. Shalom.